What we can say about Sumeya's account with certainty is that it's a memory shaped by fear, passed through decades of retelling before it reached us. The specific details of the account may vary due to inconsistencies across many retellings. We can also say Sumeya's father was a skeptical man who was determined to refute his friend's claims. 3 nights alone by candlelight with a book described as the most dangerous in the world in a hot and quiet village is not a neutral psychological condition. Fear and expectation can be overpowering, and the mind under those circumstances will find what it's looking for. And yet, Sumeya's father was not the first person to sit down with this book and find something. By the time these accounts began making the rounds, the book had already left Albuni's circle and traveled far beyond it. Through Ottoman courts, through printing houses in Beirut, through the hands of scholars and charlatans and curious men. At each stop, it left something behind. And as I told you, not everyone gets a patient one. There was a man in Cairo who understood exactly what he was dealing with. A man who had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this. And it still wasn't enough. Al-Husseini al-Falaki was an astrologer and a spiritual healer. Not an amateur, not a dabbler. He worked openly within the tradition that the Shams al-Ma'arif describes, and he was known for it. Politicians consulted him, celebrities sought him out, and he had spent decades learning the rules, studying the warnings, understanding, or so he believed, the difference between what you call and what answers. In 1988, Egyptian director Yassin Ismail Yassin cast him in the film He Returns for Revenge, in which he played a spiritual healer. Al-Husseini took the role literally. On the set, he performed a real invocation. He summoned a jinn. What happened next, the cast and crew would spend years trying not to talk about. On the second day of filming, a props assistant was found curled in the corner of a storage room, unable to speak. He didn't return to work, and he didn't explain why. A camera operator who had worked on dozens of productions walked off the set on the third day and told the director only that he would not go back inside that building. During a night shoot, 3 separate crew members in different parts of the set with no communication between them independently reported the same thing. A figure standing just outside the frame of every shot, present in every take, visible to no one on camera. Gone the moment anyone looked directly at where it had been. One of the lead actresses began refusing to enter her dressing room alone after the second week. She never said what she had seen in there. She finished the film, and she did not speak about that production for the rest of her career. Al-Husseini completed his work and returned to his practice, but he was different. People who worked with him in the years that followed noticed it first in small ways. He began building elaborate protections into every session, rituals before rituals, safeguards he had never needed before. And he stopped taking certain kinds of cases. He once told a colleague in the mid-1990s that he had made a mistake on that set, that he had called something that had decided not to leave. By the late 1990s, people who saw him regularly said he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in years. His energy, which had always been formidable, was diminished in a way no one could attribute to age alone. He lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. His hands, which had always been steady, had developed a tremor. He told the same colleague that whatever had come through on that set had found a way to stay close, that it was taking something from him, slowly, consistently, the way a drain works, not all at once, but without stopping. He kept working. He kept telling people he had it under control. In 2003, he was found dead in his home in Fez al-Giza. He was 58 years old. His face was contorted into an expression that the people who found him could not describe without looking away. Not pain, exactly. something worse. The expression of a man who had seen something incomprehensible in his final moments. The head of investigations from Bulak stated publicly that the cause of death could not be determined. What they found in the apartment took longer to explain than the body itself. An inordinate quantity of milk, bowls of it, containers of it, arranged in a way that suggested intention rather than accident. Pieces of fabric soaked in human fluids, knotted in specific ways. Evidence, to those who understood what they were looking at, of a final attempt. A last effort to push something back, to close a door that had been open for 15 years. It hadn't worked. The djinn he had summoned on that film set in 1988 had never left. For 15 years, it had stayed close, draining him, wearing him down, waiting. And when he had finally attempted to force it out, when he had gathered everything he had left and tried to end it, it had completely turned on him. His death changed nothing. The book kept circulating. The people kept coming. A researcher named Ilyana Saif visited booksellers in downtown Amman while studying the book's cultural history, wanting to understand who was still seeking it out and why. And something interesting happened. Every single one of them, different shops, different men, did the same thing. They leaned in. And then they used a phrase from the Quran. It's the moment the Pharaoh turns on his own magicians after they abandon him and bow to Moses. Furious, he points at Moses and says, "Their chief who taught them sorcery." The hidden ringleader, the one who started it all, the secret source behind everything. That phrase, written 1400 years ago, is what booksellers in modern-day Jordan reach for when someone asks about a man who died in the 13th century. Not a scholar or an author, the chief who taught them sorcery. They think whatever Al-Bundi put into the world is still moving through it, passing from hand to hand, shop to shop, generation to generation. The book doesn't need to find its readers. Its readers always find it. When Saif asked the booksellers who their customers were, the answer was the same across every shop. Healers who used its talismans and magic squares on people who came to them sick, desperate, out of options. Young men who wanted what the book promises, the ability to call something and have it answer. Teenagers who were being bullied, who had run out of other ways to feel like they had any power at all. And then the curious ones, people who didn't even believe in any of it, who just wanted to see what was inside. The last group, in a way, is the most troubling. At least the others knew what they were reaching for. For those now wondering what happens to people who intentionally summon something, maybe something really specific. There's a story that has been circulating in Arabic-speaking communities for years. Nobody knows his name. Nobody knows exactly which city he was from. What people know is that he was a young man in Saudi Arabia who found the book. He wasn't looking for power. He was lonely. He was married to a beautiful wife, had a family, but you know how some men are. He wanted something more. And the book, if you know how to read it, tells you how to call things that will answer. And something answered. She came to him gradually, the way these things apparently do. Not all at once, not dramatically. First, as a presence he could feel in the room. Then as a voice. Then as something he could see. In the moments between sleep and waking, standing at the edge of his room, watching him. A breathtakingly beautiful woman. Beautiful in a way that felt wrong. The way a dream can feel wrong even when nothing in it is technically frightening. Everything about her presence was hypnotizing. He was completely drawn in.
I just want to know why. Why you people mess with dark arts? I'm thinking something good is gonna come out of it. It makes no sense. Yeah, these are like YouTube videos and channels I be watching a lot. They be there, these things to get into. Um, from here we're gonna go into like anime in a minute. So yeah, if you're trying to like and subscribe, she's real cool too. She hitting up. You can try my channel too.
And he didn't tell anyone. How do you tell someone that? By the time his family noticed something was different about him, it had already been months. He stopped going out. He stopped eating properly. He had stopped looking people in the eye the way he used to. His mother asked him what was wrong. He told her nothing. What nobody understood then was that by the time you can see the change in someone, the arrangement has already been made. In the tradition surrounding this book, there is a concept, a binding. Once a jinn decides to stay, leaving is not something that happens because you want it to. He secretly married her. He went through the steps, said the words, made it real in whatever way these things are made real. And she was, by all accounts he gave to the one person he eventually confessed to, devoted to him. Completely, terrifyingly devoted. The problem with that kind of devotion is what it does to everything else. His wife, his human wife, died first. It was ruled natural causes.
Yeah.
She was young and healthy and had shown no signs of illness. But these things happen. And there was nothing the doctors could point to that said otherwise. His mother followed 3 months later, then his father, then his wife's parents, one after the other, in the same quiet, inexplicable way. No violence, no clear cause, just life ending the way a candle goes out when something unseen blows across it. He was left completely alone. People who knew him said that in those final months, he didn't seem like a man who was grieving. He seemed like a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted, and only then understood what it had cost. And nobody knows what happened to him after that. The story just stops, the way these stories always stop, right at the edge of the part nobody survived to tell. The Shams al-Ma'arif was never supposed to leave the room it was written in. As I told you before, Al-Bundi wrote it for students he knew personally, people who had spent years preparing for it, under his guidance. The warning was built into the text itself. This knowledge is real, the forces it describes are real, and someone who picks it up without preparation isn't just reading a book. They are announcing themselves to something that was already listening. And that warning traveled with every copy. And still, it changed nothing. Today it exists in multiple languages across multiple continents. And in every language, in every community, people keep coming back to the same word when they talk about it. The Arabic word, Qatar, danger. The warning is still there in every copy, every translation, every cheap print sold out of a crowded bookshop. It survived the banning, the burning, the burying. We don't know what happened to most of them. There are many stories, and maybe that's the most unsettling part, because when something goes wrong with this book, the people who could tell you about it aren't always around to do so. So, what about you? If you stumbled upon a book you were warned never to open, would you be able to leave it closed?
Yeah.
Okay, that is the end of tonight's story. Good night, beauties and beasts, and see you in the next episode. Bye-bye. In 2003, American soldiers stationed on the top of the ruins of Babylon started hearing screaming in the sky, and no one could explain it. A local translator told them not to ask. He said, "What's under those ruins has been screamed and any religion has existed." So today we're going to talk about what's down there, or to be more precise, what's inside the forbidden well of Babylon. Now, I want to be very clear about something. What you're about to hear is not scripture, and it's not an attempt to interpret or challenge anyone's faith. This story comes from local folklore and from accounts shared by soldiers who were stationed near the ruins of Babylon in Iraq in 2003. And if you're not familiar with the religious background here, that is completely fine. Of course, I will walk you through it. So, Babylon, or Babil as Iraqis call it, is one of the oldest cities in recorded history. It predates Islam, Christianity, and even Judaism. For thousands of years, people believed knowledge came from there. Powerful knowledge, sometimes sacred, sometimes dangerous. And Babylon has a pattern. Every empire that has tried to claim it has paid a price. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful king Babylon ever had, the one who built its greatest monuments and conquered Jerusalem, he turned it into a wonder of the ancient world. It fell. Alexander the Great conquered it and declared it would be his new capital. But he died there at 32 before he could realize his plan. Saddam Hussein rebuilt parts of it in the 1980s, stamped his own name onto new bricks alongside Nebuchadnezzar's, and built a palace overlooking the ruins as if he were the next great king. And we all know how that ended. Babylon doesn't belong to anyone, and it seems to punish those who forget that. When Staff Sergeant Matthew Hale was deployed to Iraq in 2003, he was stationed at a forward operating base near the ruins of the ancient city. The base was called Camp Alpha, and it sat directly on top of the archaeological site, the same ground where the Hanging Gardens of Babylon supposedly once stood. And if you haven't heard of them, the Hanging Gardens were one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Massive terraces of trees and plants built by King Nebuchadnezzar for his wife, rising above the city like a man-made mountain of green in the middle of the desert. Nothing like it had ever been built before. And over 2,500 years later, American soldiers were parking tanks on top of where it used to be. So during the day, the place looked like what you would expect from an archaeological site. Broken foundations, exposed brick, layers of civilizations built on top of one another. Soldiers walked past walls decorated with ancient dragons and lions, and those symbols were glazed into bricks that were over 2,500 years old. At night, some said those figures seemed to move when caught by flashlight, exactly as they were designed to when lit by torchlight during ancient processions. But almost immediately, he noticed something that didn't sit right. It wasn't a ghost sighting. It wasn't anything dramatic at first. It was equipment. Vehicles stalled for no clear reason. Radios lost signal, warning lights flickered, and then went dark. At first, everyone blamed the desert heat. Sand gets into everything, military equipment breaks down. But the strange part was how consistently these failures happened whenever they moved close to the ruins, especially near the old temple area and a particular well. And then the screaming started. The first time Matthew heard it, he almost ignored it. He was on watch just after midnight, wearing night vision goggles and scanning the perimeter like he had done dozens of times before. The base was quiet, in the way military bases sometimes are late at night. Low hum of generators, distant shifting of metal, controlled stillness. And then he heard a scream. It wasn't sudden, like someone being attacked. It didn't sound like gunfire or an explosion. It rose gradually, like something building in intensity. It sounded strange, not sharp, not startled, but prolonged. The kind of scream that sounds exhausted, as if whatever was making it had been doing so for a very long time. What unsettled him most wasn't just the sound itself. It was where it seemed to be coming from. It wasn't coming from the ground. It was above them. He lowered his goggles and looked up into the dark sky. but of course, he couldn't see anything. The desert night was almost completely black. No city lights nearby, no clear moon that night. He keyed his radio and asked if anyone else had heard it. One guard said no. Another, after a pause, said yes. Not everyone on the perimeter heard it. And that detail was strange. They were all within roughly 100 meters of each other. Same equipment, same environment. So why would some hear it and others not? The sound faded slowly. It didn't move away like an aircraft would. It didn't echo like it should have in open terrain. It just stopped. The next day, they tried to rationalize it. Maybe jackals? Iraq has wildlife that can make unsettling sounds at night. Maybe a large bird. Maybe wind moving strangely through the ruins. Matthew later tried looking up recordings of local animals. Owls, hawks, vultures, anything that might explain what he heard. But nothing matched. Over the next few weeks, it happened every night, not on a schedule. Sometimes it was brief, a single drawn-out shriek that lasted 10 seconds and just cut off. Other times, it went on long enough that the men found themselves silently counting, waiting for it to end. And what made it worse was the movement. More than one soldier reported that the sound seemed to start near the ruins themselves, low, somewhere near the old temple area, and then rise upward into the sky and circling overhead. Not fast like a jet, just steady and almost deliberate. Motion sensors around the perimeter triggered on a few of those nights. Infrared systems picked up movement. But when they reviewed the recordings, there was nothing visible on playback. One corporal tried a thermal scope, military equipment that detects body heat. Anything alive shows up. He pointed it toward the ruins on a night when the sound was active. He saw shapes, multiple, moving, but no heat signature. He said it's like they're dead, or were never alive. That's when it stopped being easy to dismiss. It was around this time that Matthew asked one of the local translators about it. His name was Hassan. He had worked with coalition forces for years and was known for being steady and pragmatic. He wasn't the kind of person who exaggerated stories or leaned into superstition. When Matthew casually mentioned the screams, Hassan didn't laugh. He didn't immediately answer either. After a moment, he said he would not go near the temple ruins at night. Not because of insurgents, not because of security concerns, because of what people believed about that place. Hassan explained carefully, almost academically. He understood that the American soldiers didn't grow up with the same religious or cultural background. In Islamic tradition, there are two figures briefly mentioned in the Quran, Harut and Marut. The Quran states that they were angels sent to Babylon and that they taught people magic, but with a warning. They would say, "We are only a test, so do not fall into disbelief." That's all the Quran says directly. Everything beyond that comes from centuries of interpretation and folklore. According to those later stories, some angels once questioned why God showed mercy to humans who seemed so prone to sin. God's response was essentially, "You think you could do better? Prove it." Two of the purest angels, Harut and Marut, volunteered. They were sent to Earth, specifically to Babylon, given human desires and told to live among people without sinning. And for a while, they succeeded. Then they were tested. A woman, often identified as Zora, came to them. She was described as extraordinarily beautiful. She didn't force them into anything. She simply offered herself, but only if they did certain things first. She asked them to join her in idolatry, to bow before a false god, one of the gravest sins an angel could commit. They refused. She asked again later, and this time she only asked them to drink wine. They thought about it. Wine seemed like a lesser sin. How much harm could one drink to? So they drank, and once they were drunk, everything unraveled. They became intimate with her. Then they realized someone had witnessed what they had done. So, to keep it a secret, they killed the witness. One sin opened the door to the next. Intoxication led to lust. Lust led to murder. But the story doesn't end there. Zora had been paying attention. During their time together, she extracted from the angels something called the Ism al-Azam, the greatest name of God, a word of such power that simply speaking it allowed the angels to ascend to heaven each night. She spoke the name, and she rose into the sky. But she didn't make it to heaven. She was trapped, frozen, and, according to the folklore, transformed into the planet Venus. Some versions say she shines there as a reward for her cleverness. Others say she is imprisoned and tortured, suspended in the sky forever. So look up on a clear night and you might see her. As for Harut and Marut, they tried to return to heaven the next morning, but they couldn't. Their link to the angels was severed. God gave them a choice: punishment now on earth or punishment later in hell. And they chose earth. Their reasoning was simple: earthly punishment, no matter how terrible, would eventually end. Hell would not. So they were bound in a well in Babylon, suspended upside down, hanging between heaven and earth, because heaven wouldn't take them back and the earth wouldn't receive them either. And here's an interesting detail. In the folklore, their mouths hang open from thirst, and the water beneath them is visible, close enough to see, close enough to almost taste. The distance between their lips and the surface is said to be no more than the thickness of a sword blade. So, close enough to drive you mad. They will hang there until the day of judgment. And according to a tradition, this wasn't just a punishment, it was a classroom. Anyone who wanted to learn forbidden magic, real magic, the kind that could separate a husband from his wife, the kind the Quran specifically warns against, would descend into that well to be taught. Harut and Marut would teach them. But first, every single time, they would repeat the same warning: we are only a test. Do not disbelieve. And every time, people learned anyway. Now, here's what makes the story feel less like a local legend and more like something older and deeper, because this isn't only an Islamic story. Long before the Quran was revealed, Jewish tradition had an almost identical account. Angels came down. They lusted after human women, and they taught people things they were never supposed to know. Sorcery, weapons, how to read the stars, and when it was over, God didn't just punish them. He had them dragged underground and chained there, bound in the earth until the end of the world. And it gets stranger. The names Harut and Marut, they aren't even Arabic. They are in Hebrew. The names trace back to a religion called Zoroastrianism, one of the oldest faiths in human history, born in ancient Persia, what we now call Iran. So it predates Christianity and Islam by centuries, and maybe as old as or older than Judaism itself. The names come from two of its archangels, which means this story doesn't belong to any single religion. It predates all of them. It has been passed down through civilizations that rose and fell and never met each other. And somehow, every version agrees on the same core details. Angels came down. They fell. They were imprisoned in Babylon, as if the story itself refuses to disappear. Hassana was very clear that this was just folklore, not core doctrine, but he also said something that Matthew didn't forget. Some places are destroyed over and over because they hide things people were never meant to understand. And then he told Matthew about the well. Near the old temple area of the ruins, a structure called the Temple of Ninmah, built thousands of years before Islam for a Sumerian goddess of creation and childbirth, there is a well in the center of the courtyard. Very deep, ancient. The inner part of the temple was restricted entirely to women. They used the water for ritual purification for prayer. And every time the temple was rebuilt across the centuries, and it was rebuilt many times, the new version was raised several meters higher than the last, layer upon layer, built on top of whatever came before. So no one knows how deep the original foundations go. Many locals believe that well is the place tied to those stories about Harut and Marut. And some believe the screams come from there. Eventually, the soldiers decided to investigate, not because they believe the folklore, because unexplained aerial sounds and equipment malfunctions are operational concerns. They set out just before sunset, planning to observe the area overnight. For the first stretch, everything seemed normal. Then the radios began to crackle and cut out. GPS units gave incorrect coordinates, placing them miles away from where they actually were. Compasses spun without stabilizing. One vehicle stalled completely. The tires lost pressure instantly without visible damage. And then the screaming began again. This time, it was closer, lower in the sky, more intense, and Matthew was watching the ruins through binoculars when he saw movement. He saw dark shapes rising upward, not flapping like birds, not mechanical. They ascended smoothly, almost vertically, before leveling out. Then they circled above the convoy, multiple shapes, and those shapes were large enough to be unmistakable against the fading indigo sky. No one could make out details. It was too dark, and whatever they were silhouetted against the last of the light. No one fired. No one gave a direct order to retreat. But the convoy turned back, and as they moved away from the ruins, the equipment began functioning again. Radios cleared, engines restarted, navigation stabilized. The mission was officially canceled due to equipment failure. Unofficially, no one wanted to go back. After the soldiers left Babylon in 2004, a team from the British Museum came to assess the damage. And what they found was, in their words, shocking. Tanks had crushed ancient brickwork. Trenches had been dug through deposits near the foundation of what many believed was the Tower of Babel, the structure from the Bible's book of Genesis, where humanity supposedly tried to build a tower to reach God, and God scattered them across the earth and scrambled their languages as punishment. Helicopter vibrations from the landing pad, built just 300 meters from the Temple of Ninmah, had caused part of the temple's roof to collapse. A British archaeologist compared the occupation to establishing a military camp around the Great Pyramid, or Stonehenge. 2,000 soldiers had lived on top of one of the most ancient places on Earth, and the place had pushed back. Matthew completed his deployment and returned home. Years later, when he speaks about it, he doesn't claim certainty. He doesn't say they were angels. He doesn't say they were jinn, supernatural beings in Islamic tradition. He simply says that something was there, and whatever it was, it did not put them near that well. Babylon has survived empires, invasions, and the collapse of entire belief systems. Its wells are still there, deep and unlit, just waiting there. No one guards those wells at night. No fence, no warning sign in any language, just an opening in the earth that has been there for longer than any living civilization. in a place that every religion agrees was used to test whether human beings could resist the thing they wanted most. So, do you believe in angels now? What do you think that screaming was? Was it something in pain? Something watching? Was it even real? I don't know, but maybe there's a lesson somewhere in all of this. Maybe not every place on Earth exists for us to explore. Not every mystery is asking to be solved, and not every door that can be opened should be. Some places do not forgive curiosity. And that is all for tonight. See you in our next episode, and I hope you guys sleep well. Bye.
Family.
Hey, beauties and beasts, welcome back to the show. Story time is on, and we get to sit back for a while, do some skincare, and relax while I'm telling you this crazy story I found on the internet. This story involves a famous singer in Kuwait, multiple witnesses, police reports, the whole thing, everything. She quit singing after this incident, and after you hear what happened to her, you will understand why she never performed again. So grab your face mask, get comfortable, maybe turn on some extra lights, and let me tell you about the night Nora and her band performed at a wedding that shouldn't have existed. Let's get started. So this actually happened to a singer named Nora back in 1997 in Kuwait. And I know everyone says their ghost story is true, but this one is different. Nora was pretty famous back then. She had this incredible voice and ran a wedding band that was basically the go-to group if you wanted your celebration to be remembered. And you know how it is with wedding singers in the Middle East. They are like rock stars in their own right. But anyways, it was a regular summer evening when she got the call. Kuwait in summer is absolute hell, by the way. So here we're talking 45 plus degrees Celsius, like 113 Fahrenheit, the kind of heat where your car's steering wheel can burn your hands. And Nora had just gotten home from another wedding gig, probably exhausted when her landline rang. And remember, this was 1997. No mobiles really, just those chunky home phones everyone had. And the guy on the other end spoke in really formal classical Arabic. That was the first slightly weird thing, but whatever. Some of the older, traditional families still spoke that way. He said his daughter was getting married, and he'd heard Nora was the best. Could she and her band perform in 3 weeks? Nora checked her schedule, and the date was free. So they talked money. He was offering good money, half up front like usual, and then he gave her the address. And this is where it starts getting a bit odd. The location was way outside the city, past the 6th Ring Road, out toward Jarrah, then another 20 kilometers beyond the farms. He said someone would meet them at a water tower to guide them the rest of the way. Now, this wasn't completely crazy. Lots of wealthy families back then still did weddings at home instead of hotels. The really old money families, the ones whose wealth came from pearls and trade before oil, they often had these massive estates outside the city where they could celebrate privately, away from the prying eyes and gossip. So Nora didn't think too much of it. The money showed up 2 days later, cash in an envelope, no return address. A bit unusual, but some families are weird about privacy. 3 weeks passed. Nora and her band practiced all the usual wedding songs. You know, the classics, the ones every Khaliji wedding has to have. Khaliji basically means Gulf Arab. So we're talking traditional songs from Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, UAE, that whole region. Her band was tight. Layla played oud, that's like a Middle Eastern lute, this beautiful pear-shaped string instrument. Mariam was on drums. Fatima and Sarah did backup vocals. And this young guy, Hassan, handled all their equipment. They've been performing together for 7 years and had an amazing reputation. The day of the wedding came. They loaded up 2 cars, Nora's Land Cruiser and Hassan's beat-up pickup truck, and headed out just before sunset. They drove north on the Jarrah Road, watching the city gradually fade into suburbs, then scattered farms, then just desert. The water tower appeared right where the guy said it would be, this massive concrete thing rising up out of nowhere. And there was someone waiting, a man in traditional dress, wearing a white dishdasha. That's the long white robe Gulf men wear, and a red-checked gutra, the headscarf, his face half covered in the dim light. He gestured for them to follow him and got into this old Mercedes that looked like it was from the 70s, but was somehow gleaming like new. They followed him off the main road onto what was barely even a track, just tire marks in the sand, really. Layla was riding with Nora, and she started shifting around uncomfortably. "This is really far out," she said. "Rich people like their space," Nora replied, but honestly, she was starting to feel uneasy too. You know that tightness in your stomach when something's not quite right, but you can't put your finger on it. They drove through the dunes for like half an hour in the dark. Kuwait's landscape is so flat and featureless that at night you can get completely disoriented. And then suddenly, there it was, this absolutely massive mansion. It was built in the old Kuwaiti style, you know, with wind towers, these traditional cooling towers that catch the breeze, and courtyards, but huge, way bigger than it needed to be. And every window was blazing with light. Despite being in the middle of nowhere, it looked perfectly maintained. The Mercedes just disappeared around back, and their guide was gone before Nora could even say thanks. A woman met them at the door, fully veiled in that old-fashioned way you hardly ever saw by the 90s. She led them through these gorgeous corridors with Persian carpets and brass lanterns, past rooms full of cushions and low tables loaded with dates and Arabic coffee. The whole place smelled intensely of bukhor. That's traditional incense made from wood chips soaked in fragrant oils, really common in the Gulf, but like a lot of it, almost too much. "You will perform here," she said, showing them to this big courtyard open to the sky. And there was a proper stage set up with outlets and everything. The bride arrives at midnight, started warming up at 10:30. Then she just disappeared before they could ask any questions. They set up their equipment while the women changed into their performance outfits. Those elaborate, heavily embroidered dresses in jewel tones, hair domed up high, full stage makeup. This was their work uniform, basically. Hassan got the sound system running, and they did a sound check around 10. But something weird happened during the sound check, though. Nora's voice echoed in this really strange way, like the space was too big and too small at the same time. She brushed it off as acoustics being weird. At 10:30, the guests started arriving. And this is where things got properly strange. They just appeared. Like 1 second an area would be empty, and then you'd look again and there'd be a cluster of people there. They came in groups, women in traditional dress, men in white dish dashas, emerging from doorways, rounding corners, just suddenly being there. Within 20 minutes, the courtyard was absolutely packed. Easily 300 people, maybe more. Nora had performed for bigger crowds, so she wasn't intimidated. She nodded to her band, and they launched into a traditional welcome song. The crowd seemed to love it, ululating loudly, that high-pitched trilling sound women make at celebrations, and they started to dance. But something felt off. At first, Nora couldn't figure out what was bothering her. The guests were enthusiastic, maybe a little too enthusiastic. They danced with this intense energy, with their movements strangely fluid and synchronized. It reminded her of something, but she couldn't quite place what. She glanced over at Layla, who was playing mechanically, staring at nothing in particular. By 11:30, the weirdness had become impossible to ignore. The way these people moved, it wasn't quite human. That is the only way to describe it. Joints bending in ways that looked subtly wrong. They danced without stopping, without even pausing to catch their breath or chat with each other like people normally do at weddings. The dancing was hypnotic, almost ritualistic, like the same movements repeating over and over in patterns that made Nora's head hurt to even watch. Some guests came up to the stage to offer congratulations and tips, totally normal wedding behavior. But when the first woman pressed money into Nora's hand, Nora felt something that made her blood run cold. The woman's skin was burning hot, not like a fever, but like touching something metal that's been sitting in the sun. And hard, leathery, completely unlike human skin. The woman smiled with these really white teeth and went back to dancing. Nora caught Fatima's eyes across the stage. Her backup singer had gone pale under all her makeup, and her hands were shaking on the microphone. She'd felt it too when someone touched her. Nora gave a tiny shake of her head. Don't react. Keep performing. The night dragged on. Midnight came and went. No bride. The crowd just kept dancing, getting more and more frenzied, more synchronized. Nora's throat was killing her, but she kept singing. Her professional training kicking in even as terror built in her chest. Next to her, Miriam was pounding the drums mechanically, her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. And then sometime after midnight, Nora was never sure exactly when, everything changed. She was in the middle of a song when she noticed. At first, she thought the incense smoke had gotten thicker, making it hard to see. But then she saw clearly, and she wished she hadn't. The legs of those guests weren't entirely human anymore. They ended in these hooved feet, dark and cloven like a goat's or sheep's, moving with an animal's grace. Their hands, when they raised them while dancing, had these elongated fingers that tapered to points, nails gleaming like horn. But their faces were still human. And that was somehow the worst part. Human faces smiling and laughing on top of these increasingly inhuman bodies, dancing, always dancing. Sarah's voice completely cracked. She'd stopped singing, just standing there with her mouth open, frozen. Hassan, at the soundboard, had gone gray, looking like he might pass out. Only Nora, Layla, Miriam, and Fatima kept going, pure muscle memory and performance discipline overriding their terror. The things dancing, Nora couldn't think of them as guests anymore. They didn't seem to notice or care that the band was freaking out. They danced harder, their movements becoming unmistakably inhuman. So she kept singing, voice cracking, tears streaming down her face, and ruining her makeup. The others kept playing, looking like they were barely holding it together. Time stopped making sense. Each song felt like it lasted hours. Nora's entire world became just next note, next breath, next moment of not running, not screaming. And then, at what her watch later told her was 3 a.m., every single light went out. The darkness was total, like, how dark it gets in the deep desert. No street lights, no ambient glow, no moon that night. Nora literally couldn't see her hand in front of her face. The music just stopped. Nobody decided to stop. Their hands just fell still in the dark. And with the music gone came silence. Complete, unnatural silence. No breathing, no footsteps, just rustling fabric. The courtyard that seconds ago held hundreds of dancing figures was utterly, impossibly still. The temperature absolutely plummeted. Nora had been sweating in the August heat. Suddenly, her sweat felt icy on her skin. She could literally see her breath misting. Frost formed on the microphone under her fingers. Yalla, yalla! Layla's voice cut through the silence, raw and terrified. Yalla basically means let's go or hurry up in Arabic. You yell it when you need to move now. So they ran. They abandoned everything, all their instruments, the sound equipment, purses, shoes, everything, and just ran blindly through the darkness. Nora's heels caught on carpet and she kicked them off, running barefoot through corridors that seemed to twist and stretch impossibly. The mansion felt enormous inside, way bigger than it should have been. Corridors multiplying, rooms opening into other rooms in ways that made no sense. And then suddenly they were outside. The desert, which had seemed so ominous approaching the mansion, now felt like salvation. Open space, stars, the distant glow of Kuwait City on the horizon telling them which way was home. They ran to their cars, fumbling with keys with shaking hands. Both engines started, thank God, and they just drove into the desert without headlights, too scared to wait, too scared to look back. They navigated by moonlight until they hit the main road. They didn't stop until they saw that water tower again. Then they pulled into a patrol station on the outskirts of the city as dawn was breaking. Under the fluorescent lights, they looked at each other, faces streaked with tears and smeared makeup, hands still shaking, eyes haunted. Nobody spoke about what they'd seen. Not then. What could they even say? Nora went to the police the next day. They listened politely while she tried to explain what happened at a mansion in the desert. But when she tried to give them the address, that's when things got really weird. An officer actually drove out there with her. The water tower was there. The track into the desert was there. She could even see their tire marks from the night before in the sand. But there was no mansion. Where that huge house had stood, there was just desert, undisturbed sand, some rocks, a few scraggly desert plants. No foundation, no debris, no sign anything had ever been there. The officer looked embarrassed for her and suggested maybe heat exhaustion, stress, maybe someone had pranked her by leading her to an empty plot. But Nora knew what she'd seen. They'd all seen it. So she went to the library and dug through old records, newspaper archives, property registries, and finally, in some dusty file of historical documents, she found it. A mansion matching that exact description had existed in that location. But the mansion had been abandoned in 1987, exactly 10 years before Nora's performance. In the weeks after, Nora tried to contact the man who'd hired her. Disconnected number. The courier company had no record of delivering that money. It was like the whole thing never existed. And Nora, she never performed again. She was only 35 at the peak of her career. When people asked why she'd retired so suddenly, she gave vague answers about wanting to focus on family, about the demanding schedule, whatever. People who knew her well could tell something had happened, but they didn't push. But the story got out eventually. Stories like that always do in Kuwait. It's a small place, everyone talks. It spread through whispers and got more elaborate and less believable with each retelling. Some said she'd seen ghosts at a wedding. Others said it was all a hoax, that she made it up for attention before retiring. But people who knew Nora, who saw that haunted look that never left her eyes, knew she was telling the truth. In Islamic tradition, jinn are real beings, created from a smokeless fire, living parallel to us, able to take different forms. They are basically supernatural creatures mentioned in the Quran, not genies from Aladdin, but actual entities with free will. They marry, they celebrate, have families, die just like humans, but according to their own ways. Sometimes through accident or intention, the worlds overlap, and humans end up somewhere they were never supposed to be. And there are rules, apparently, for these encounters. You have to be respectful. Once you accepted their hospitality, you can't just leave. You can't insult them or freak out. You recite protective prayers, keep your cool, and only leave when dismissed. By continuing to perform, even as reality twisted around her, by fulfilling the contract despite her terror, maybe Nora accidentally followed these rules. She and her band were allowed to leave, traumatized but alive. The mansion, if it was ever really there, is gone. The desert around Kuwait holds a lot of secrets. The traditional desert nomads who've crossed these lands for centuries know this. Sometimes the old folks say we're not the only ones celebrating the desert night. Sometimes the jinn have their weddings too. And if they call for musicians, they expect to be entertained. And Nora knows this now. She lives quietly in the Kuwait city with her family. She doesn't perform anymore, but sometimes hums old songs to her grandkids. She never drives toward Jara. She never answers calls from numbers she doesn't recognize. And every August, when it gets hot and thick with desert dust, she locks her doors at sunset and burns bukhor until dawn, praying that whatever still dances in that empty place in the desert has forgotten about the singer with a beautiful voice who once performed for them. Some invitations should never be accepted, and some performances are meant to last forever. And that was one hell of a story, right? The story is quite famous on the internet, and there are some variations to it, but the core remains the same. Whatever those things were, they weren't human, which is super creepy if you think about it. So, yeah, next time you get a gig in the middle of nowhere, maybe ask a few more questions first. And if the guests start looking a little too not human, trust your instincts. Anyway, that's it for today's story time, and let me know in the comments if you've heard this story before or if you have any other creepy tales you want me to cover. Hope you guys sleep well, and I will catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.
I see you know. I say, hold on. I see you, man. Lincoln being in the middle of the man. Lincoln? He would. I think he'll do a pair. I think he'll do what Penham is doing. That's how I feel about it. Well, Lincoln being is a really get off too. My boys say, you know why we're wearing this clothes, right? They say, oh, flip no. I was, boy, when he said that, I was crying from laughter, man. I had to put it back and play it again. They said, no, boy. Lincoln he just say that just now. Not like I mean that, boy. He mean that. Ah, man, we vibrations are still being alive today. Yeah, they're gonna beat up as soon as they walk. You with the second one down, as soon as they walk in. What do you mean? They can win a car. All the time. What they can do? What they gotta do for this? That's the question. Something like that. I'll tell you all. Oh, for every 25 plus some exhaustion.